which is the work really about having patients and families at the bedside, and the importance of having families there. Sheryl's worked really hard to do some amazing work. She's been an incredible participant in Change Day and made a truly touching blog post. If you haven't had a chance to check it out yet, Michelle's going to pop that link to that blog post in the chat box so you can move forward and listen to it or read Sheryl's story. She's here to join us now, though, to talk about her story, some of the work she's doing around compassion, and a very personal understanding of healthcare and what it's like, the healthcare experience can be like for residential school survivors. So it's with pleasure now to hand it over to Sheryl for her presentation. Welcome, Sheryl.
Hello?
Hello, Sheryl. Great. Oh. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi. I'll just, I guess, give a little bit of background about myself. I live in Surrey. I work in Surrey. My dad became ill. He had a workplace accident in December of 1976. He fell from a scaffolding about 20 feet and landed on a concrete slab on his left side. So he had circulation problems. And his lower leg would ulcerate, it would get infected. He had a number of surgeries over the years, quite a few surgeries. But he continued to work, I guess, for, oh gosh, probably about 14 years, I think, sometime into the 90s, the early 90s, before he was just not able to work anymore. He developed dementia. He was officially diagnosed in 2011, I think. My mom actually retired in 2007 to take over his medications and care because he would actually forget that he had already taken his medications. We noticed that he was running out of his T3s. He was running out of a month's worth of T3s in 2 weeks. In April of 2015, Mom called me. He was just totally unresponsive at home. We noticed that he was not the same, but we weren't sure if it was the dementia or what it was. But we called his home care nurses, and they said to call 911 because they weren't sure if it was a stroke or. So he was brought into the hospital, and it turned out that it was a bone infection. Sorry, I can't see the slides from here, so, but his ulcerated leg, the wound care nurse was actually taking off pieces of flesh that were green and black, and you could actually see part of the bone, like it was right down to the bone. He was septic, yet he was septic, so he was cited as having behavioral issues in emergency. But this only happened when Mom and I stepped away. And we would only step away because there was nowhere to stand around his bed in emergency. When we would come back to the bed, we saw that security was walking away, and they were exhausted, and they told us that he is super strong. and they had physically restrained him. Anyhow, I participated in a couple of phone calls these past couple of days with the Engagement Radicals, and I answered a few questions for them. So I guess I'll go back and just tell you a bit about my dad and who he was to me and to my family. I always thought my dad was a really strong person, just physically, and his demeanor, and just everything he did for everyone. I say that he is the ultimate survivor and the ultimate provider. He worked hard for our family. He was an iron worker. He worked on the original dome of BC Place. He actually stood on top of it when it was first raised. He built buildings and bridges all over BC and the Yukon. He did all of this even after his work accident. He lived in pain every day for 39 years. But he worked hard and he played hard. And this was difficult growing up. Difficult for me even as an adult and even now. But now that I understand what he went through in his childhood, being taken away from his mom and being taken away to residential school and what happened to him in residential school, I understand why he was the way he was. When you're taken away from your parents as a child, you aren't given the foundation or the certainty of parental love, the safety and protection, your language, your culture. So our childhood was hard, probably because his was unbearable and traumatic. But I know how much he sacrificed for us, so I love him so much. The second question that I was asked was based on what I pledged, the two things that I believe most need to be changed within the healthcare system. So Dad was in the hospital, the tertiary palliative care unit, and the hospice for a total of 7 months and 1 week. And Mom and I really felt that we needed to be here all the time as much as we could to protect him. There were so many nurses and care aides who were so kind-hearted and so amazing, but at the same time there were a few who were really stressed out. They were burnt out. So I think there definitely needs to be more staff, but the right kind of staff. People who genuinely care. I gave an example. One day I was by my dad's bed just holding his hand while he slept. And there was a constant, a care aide sitting with Dad's roommate, and she was having a difficult time. And she vented to me that it was like working with a 2-year-old. And I didn't look at her, and I didn't say anything. I just didn't acknowledge her comment. I just knew that Dad's roommate also had a daughter who visited him quite a bit, and she wouldn't appreciate the comment. And Dad's roommate wouldn't appreciate being called a 2-year-old. I always say that people with dementia are not 2-year-olds. They're not children. They're not babies. They are still our parents, our grandparents, our spouses. They're still our friends. They're they deserve dignity. They deserve respect. They've lived more and they've accomplished more than we know. And we need to honor their journey and not treat them like delinquents. One thing that I really wanted to mention, actually the whole time that Tad was in hospital, I kept hearing the word diapers. And I don't think that for adults they should be called diapers. The patient and family, I don't think, appreciate this. They're not marketed this way on TV for adults. I just think keep patient dignity in mind. Words are so important. And for dementia, families at this time are in grief already. The second thing I think needs to be changed would be family inclusion. Every room Dad was in those 7 months, I thought I would stay with him if there was a recliner or a small cot or something. In the beginning, even in acute care downstairs, I was putting 2 chairs together because he was pulling his IV out and he was falling behind in his antibiotic schedule. I also think there wouldn't be much of a need or as much of a need for the Haldol or the antipsychotic injections and the physical restraints if family was present to help calm and help reorient. I just think the hospital environment, maybe for people who went to residential school, I think the environment is just too similar, and calling security and applying the restraints to the wrists and the ankles and injecting the Haldol, it just really added to the similarity because this was the only place that Dad was lashing out. At home, he was having night terrors, but we were able to calm him down. Here, when he was having night terrors, security was called. And it was just really traumatic for Mom and I. It was hard to come here and see that. Why was it important for me to represent my dad's voice in my pledge? It was his experience. I could feel it. One day, I arrived at the hospital after work, and Dad was shaking, and he was teary, and he asked me how they let me in. And I told him I parked downstairs in the parkade, and he seemed really surprised like I've never seen before. And he told me he didn't say a word all day because he didn't want to get into trouble. He was just really scared, like I've never seen him before. This is my dad, who is so strong, and I had never seen him like that. And I knew that the dementia mixed with the hospital environment was taking him back all the way to residential school. And knowing what I know about residential school and what I don't know, the things that he wouldn't tell me happened there, it was just absolutely chilling. Children taken away to residential schools felt abandoned. They didn't know why they couldn't come home. They didn't know that their parents didn't have enough money to go all the way there to pick them up for Christmas or to pick them up and bring them home for summer. They just thought they were abandoned. And I knew that Every night Mom and I went home, Dad felt abandoned and scared. And I just will never forget the nights when he asked us not to forget where he was. And it just ripped my heart out every night that I couldn't stay here with him. And coming out of my first year of grief, because it was super heavy grief, I realized that Dad was not the only one. He wasn't the only residential school survivor. I realized that Dad's experience might be happening to somebody else right now, somewhere across Canada. And I just became so worried because it was so hard for us. It was so hard for Mom and I. And I wasn't afraid to speak up to the nurses and the doctors with my concerns. And Mom used to be a psychiatric nurse. So if it was that hard for us, then how much harder would it be for other Native people who didn't feel as confident in speaking up, who have a bigger fear of healthcare providers? It just really bothered me so much that it kept me up at night, and it still does. And I just really thought I had to say something to somebody. So the fourth question, in what ways do you think you'll know the healthcare system is responding to your call for change? I think when we feel safe, comforted, and protected by our healthcare providers, when we don't automatically freeze when they speak to us. Actually, the hope would be that they speak with us and not to us. And there's a huge difference. And I really think that we feel it and we know when it's happening. And my grief counselor said it's actually a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. Also, I think when I don't hear so many stories of people being afraid to go to the doctor or afraid to go to the hospital, or if they do, so many stories of negative experiences. I would love to hear positive experiences. I'd love to see inclusion and hear more stories about it. Families know the patient the best. If they're included, it can only enhance patient care and safety. Any words of wisdom for change agents on the call? Behaviors in dementia are understood to be responses. They should actually just be called responses because there's no real incentive to solve a behavior. It's just a behavior, and it's almost frowned upon, even with children. But a response is something that you have to figure out. What happened? What caused this? We need to look deeper. Residential school survivors have lived the unspeakable, and I don't think they should have to relive it or be re-traumatized in the hospital, palliative care unit, or in the hospice. It did happen in all of those places with my dad. Families shouldn't be traumatized while visiting their loved ones. But this did happen with my mom and I. If trauma is happening, we should walk people through the darkness and not contribute to it. So that was my 5 questions. And I have to apologize, I can't see. I had a PowerPoint presentation with a lot of pictures and more information, but I can't see it from this end.
I'm so sorry, Sheryl, that you can't see the pictures. We have been scrolling through them, so just so you know, they are up on the screen. We've just sort of slowly been moving through them during your presentation today, so thank you. Wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. You said something at the very end about help people through the darkness, not contribute to it. And I think that's such an incredibly powerful statement. You know, when you share your personal experience of what the health care experience was like for your father, along that continuum of care for him as a residential school survivor, I think you've surfaced such an incredibly important topic and such an important conversation about the history and story of people being so important in their care and how families know the patients better than anyone else. And if they know that individual, they can help provide the best care and ensure the safest care, and the importance of maintaining that dignity. And I think you've just shared an incredibly remarkable story, and the photos that you've shared through this session have just been beautiful. And if you can't see the WebEx chat box, just know, Sheryl, there's a million comments showing up here about thanking you for your bravery, thank you for highlighting this issue, thank you for sharing the story, and reminding people about the fact that language and words matter in this entire process as well. Maybe hand it back to you if there's anything else you wanted to say.
Oh, I could probably talk about this for hours because it was a long experience. It was lonely. I know I've said that I don't think it's just on healthcare providers to change. I would still like to figure out how to get families to be more involved with their loved ones' care, right from going with them to doctor's appointments, right through to bereavement. I've encouraged my own family members. My grandma is 94, and I have talked my mom and my aunts to going with her to her doctor's appointments, and I've actually gone with her to her specialist appointment in Vancouver, and she is so grateful. It's so important to be involved. It's so important to be involved in the hospital. I was speaking with somebody else about, I started volunteering with the Hospice Society, and my mom and I were having a conversation about volunteers. There are volunteers who go into the hospice. There are volunteers who go into the tertiary palliative care unit. And we know that there are hospital volunteers, but we're not sure if they actually visit patients. Patients with dementia who are in the hospital, I'm not sure, but I think they tend to be in the hospital for a long time, and it's a lonely time. Other than Mom and I, my dad's most regular visitor was Kathy with the Hospitality Network. I think she goes all over the hospital. She said hi to him every day that she worked, and it was so good. She made him smile every day until it wasn't physically possible for him to smile. And there needs to be more of that, because when Mom and I couldn't be there, he was just wondering where everybody was. And I mean, that's just not helping anyone get better. I would just love to solve so many more problems. I would just love to be there for so many more people.
And I think that's the gift today, Sheryl, that you've really given us. And just to thank you so much for sharing the story of your father, sharing the photos along the way, and sharing, I think, that really key message you leave us with as we all move forward around change and transformation is that by sharing this story, I think there's that potential for that reach and that ability to do more. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.